The room fell deadly silent when Ibrahim Traoré pulled out a worn Bible and slammed it on the table between them. "This book," the Burkina Faso president said, his voice cutting through the air like a blade, "either saved Africa or destroyed it. And Mr. Mamdani, before you leave this room, you will question everything you thought you knew about faith, power, and liberation." Zohran Mamdani, the New York State Assembly member who had debated senators and confronted billionaires, felt his confidence waver. He had come to Ouagadougou expecting a standard diplomatic discussion about international relations and socialist movements. Instead, he found himself face to face with a 35-year-old revolutionary, whose eyes burned with the intensity of someone who had stared down death and colonialism both. "Do you believe in God, Mr. Mamdani?" Traoré asked, not waiting for pleasantries. I come from a Muslim background, though I consider myself more secular," Zohran replied carefully. Traoré smiled, but it wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone about to dismantle everything you think you understand. "Good, then you can hear this without the burden of defensive faith. Let me tell you what they don't teach in your American universities about Christianity in Africa." He stood up, his military fatigues a stark reminder that this wasn't just a politician but a soldier who had led cause against corruption. When the missionaries first arrived in Burkina Faso, they came with two gifts, the Bible and the promise of civilization. My great-grandfather watched them arrive in his village. Do you know what they told him? That his ancestors were burning in hell. That every ritual, every tradition, every prayer his people had offered for thousands of years was devil worship. Zohran shifted uncomfortably. He had read about colonialism, had written papers on it. But hearing it from someone whose family lived through it was different. "But here's what will shock you," Traoré continued, picking up the Bible again. "This book right here belonged to my grandmother. She was a devout Christian. Every night she would read to me about Jesus Christ, about his sacrifice, about his humility. And you know what she taught me? That true faith doesn't make you powerful. It makes you humble. That true Christianity isn't about conquering nations. It's about serving the least among us." He opened the Bible to a marked page. Matthew chapter 6, verse 24. "No one can serve two masters. Either you will hate the one and love the other, or you will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve both God and money. Do you understand what this means, Mr. Mamdani? That material wealth and spiritual devotion are incompatible?" Zohran offered, "No." Traoré's voice rose with passion. "It means that the Western churches that supported slavery, that blessed colonial armies, that accumulated billions in the Vatican while African children starved, they weren't serving Christ. They were serving money, power, empire. They took Jesus' name and used it to justify the greatest crimes in human history." Zohran leaned forward. "So you're saying Christianity itself isn't the problem?" Traoré sat back down, his intensity not diminishing. "I'm saying that Jesus Christ was a revolutionary. He was born in poverty, lived among the marginalized, challenged the religious authorities of his time, and was executed by the state as a criminal. Does that sound like someone who would support kings and colonizers?" He pulled out another document, yellowed with age. "This is a letter from a French missionary in 1897. Listen to what he wrote. We must make the African forget his past, his traditions, his very identity. Only then can we mold him into a proper Christian and productive colonial subject. They didn't want to save our souls. Mr. Mamdani, they wanted to erase our memories." "But your grandmother remained Christian despite this?" Zohran asked, genuinely curious now. Traoré's expression softened for the first time. "My grandmother understood something that the colonizers never could. She separated Jesus from imperialism. She read the Sermon on the Mount and saw a brown man from the Middle East telling the oppressed that they were blessed, that the meek would inherit the earth, that those who hunger for justice would be satisfied. She didn't see a white European God demanding submission." He stood up again and walked to a bookshelf filled with theological texts. "I've read everything, Mr. Mamdani. Liberation theology from Latin America. Black theology from your own country. African indigenous theology. And you know what they all say? That the Jesus of the Gospels would be horrified by what has been done in his name. Zohran felt something stirring in him, a recognition of truth he hadn't expected to find in this conversation. So what do you believe, President Traoré? Truly? Traoré turned to face him fully. I believe that faith without justice is dead. I believe that any God worth worshipping would care more about a starving child than a golden cathedral. I believe that when Jesus said, "Love your neighbor as yourself," he didn't add, "except if they're African or poor or different from you." He walked back to the table and placed his hand on the Bible. This book contains beautiful wisdom, the Beatitudes, the parables about mercy and forgiveness, the radical idea that the last shall be first. But somewhere between Jerusalem and Africa, between the upper room and the slave ships, that message got twisted into something dark. And yet you keep that Bible, Zohran observed. Because my grandmother taught me that we don't throw away truth because liars used it for evil. We reclaim it. We live it authentically. When I fight against French imperialism, when I stand against the corporations stealing our resources, when I refuse to let my people be slaves in their own land, I'm living more like Jesus than any megachurch pastor flying in private jets. The conviction in his voice was undeniable. Zohran realized he was witnessing something rare, a leader who had wrestled with faith and power and emerged with clarity rather than cynicism. You came here thinking I would be anti-Christian, Traoré said, reading Zohran's thoughts. Many people do. They hear that I kicked out French troops, that I'm reclaiming our sovereignty, and they assume I must hate everything Western, including Christianity. But that's not it at all. He sat down one final time, his eyes locked on Zohran's. I'm not against Christianity. I'm against hypocrisy. I'm against using Jesus' name to justify oppression. I'm against a version of faith that builds walls instead of bridges, that accumulates wealth instead of distributing it, that blesses bombs instead of beating them into plowshares. Then what does true Christianity look like to you? Zohran asked, completely absorbed now. Traoré smiled genuinely this time. It looks like sacrifice for others. It looks like standing with the powerless against the powerful. It looks like my grandmother, who never went to seminary but understood Jesus better than most theologians because she lived his teachings. She fed the hungry, visited the sick, welcomed the stranger. She didn't preach empire. She practiced love. He paused, letting his words sink in. And it looks like knowing that God, if he exists, doesn't need our defense. He needs our obedience to justice. The Christ I learned about from my grandmother wouldn't ask, "Do you believe in me?" He would ask, "Did you feed the hungry? Did you stand with the oppressed? Did you love mercy and walk humbly?" Zohran sat back, speechless. He had come prepared to discuss politics and economics. Instead, he had received a theology lesson that challenged everything he thought he understood about faith, power, and revolution. "You've given me a lot to think about," Zohran finally said. Traoré nodded. "Good, because the world needs people who can see beyond the false choices presented to us. You don't have to choose between faith and justice, between tradition and progress, between African identity and universal truth. You just have to have the courage to separate what is real from what is propaganda." As Zohran left that office in Ouagadougou, the sun setting over Burkina Faso, he carried with him not just notes for a political article, but questions that would haunt him for years. What does it mean to truly follow principles of justice? How do we separate spiritual truth from imperial manipulation? And perhaps most importantly, can faith survive when stripped of power and return to its revolutionary roots? IBRAHIM Traoré had done exactly what he promised. He had left Zohran Mamdani speechless, not through anger or condemnation, but through a deeper truth that transcended simple narratives about religion and politics. Sometimes the most powerful conversations aren't about having all the answers. They're about asking the right questions.